Russia relapsed into its worst flaws right when it had the chance to do otherwise. In the 60 years between 1860 and World War I, Russia, as a freer society, experienced a lot of industrialization. Its artistic and cultural high point, and even had a weak parliament.
In 1914, Russia was the fourth industrial power in the world, and the first when it comes to national debt. Its coal industry was dominated by French capital. Its oil industry and gold mining industry were dominated by British capital. That is the main reason why Russian Empire joined Entente in World War I. But since German investment was also huge, cutting ties with Germany and Austria cost Russian economy greatly. After 1914, it goes into decline. The Russian economy, Western capital, was like a drug. It can stimulate you for a short time period, but is very destructive in the long run. The Russian bureaucrats and bourgeoisie ignored the problem and chose to blame each other. Well, mostly. Sometimes people like Chairman Rezanka would point out that Russian inflation was at troubling levels, and if the ruling class cannot maintain control, then the parliament is just a waste of taxpayers' money. I wish Americans would stop obsessing over this sacred cow.
For a few months, Russia was a parliamentary republic during World War I. I think this is one of those moments in history which hinged on leadership. The communists had one of the best leaders of the century, that being Lenin, and the whites had no such leader.
I knew it. I knew that he is a Leninist. On a serious note, I'm pleasantly surprised that he knows about the first revolution of 1917. Generally, people tend to assume that it was Lenin who overthrew Nikolai II. However, this young man seems to get the wrong impression of that revolution. He makes it seem as if Russia became a stable republic, and Lenin just won it over by the power of his charisma, as if he won a parliamentary election or presidential election. It's a common knowledge that Lenin led the October Revolution, but what is interesting that he used to live in Switzerland and only came back to Russia on April the 3rd of 1917, long past the day when Nikolai II lost his throne. Almost immediately, Lenin was officially recognized as a criminal. He had to live in hiding pretty much up until October 25th. Now let's add up the fact that Bolsheviks had very little influence in Russian Empire. They had powerful rivals in other socialist parties, and all socialist parties in general were the underdog of Russian politics up until the October Revolution. So Lenin's seat in power should have been impossible, and yet it happened, which says something. In 1916, monarchists started planning to get rid of Duma. Meanwhile, certain enthusiasts among Duma's delegates and some other influential people, including the members of the royal family, started to plan a palace coup. They managed to strike first, essentially forcing Nikolai II to abdicate, but they failed to seize the power. I suppose it's hard for an American to understand because USA never went through such an ordeal. But Russia didn't turn into a republic. Russia ceased to exist as a state. There was a hope for it emerging again as a republic, but it required lots of steps, starting with the new constitution. Meanwhile, the country was in disarray and the war was still going on. Interesting thing about democracy, it can only exist in peaceful times. Similarly, the bourgeoisie can only be productive in peaceful times. Russian oligarchs could be productive and creative, like the merchant Konstantin Markov, who basically created the city Melikes and led it for almost 40 years. But the power vacuum called for a different type of leaders. Did the White Movement possess charismatic leaders? Of course. Denikin, Wrangel, Kolchak, especially Kolchak. What Whites lacked was unity. Also, they over-relied on Russia's allies in Entente. That was a big mistake. Kolchak wanted Russia to be a strong and independent country which would take back all of the gold stolen by foreign invaders. Of course the West wouldn't let him leave. I'm not revealing any secrets here, it's all common knowledge. I wonder if this young man has ever read anything written by Sheila Fitzpatrick or Leopold Hameson. They might have given him a different understanding of Russia in early 20th century. When talking about Russia in 13th or 14th century, he also clearly didn't rely on Marshall Pole's or John Fallon's work. He cannot get basic facts right. This paints his sources in a very bad light. I'm terrified of the amount of views he has. Although I'm hardly the one to complain, most of the sources I've used are not translated into English. With the current level of technology, it's a fixable issue, but sometimes I feel as if English speakers ignore Russian sources on principle. Not all, of course. There are scientists who want to do actual research, but most tend to focus on poems or memoirs of people with a suitable political views, then get emotional about it and proclaim that they understand the Russian civilization. Someone who claims to fight for the truth should keep such impulses in check.
A sad thing about Russia is that it just gave up its empire willingly.
And yet the Western invaders couldn't conquer it. The sad thing indeed. Such an opportunity wasted. I've heard one of the reasons was the bad morale of the troops, but I can't know for sure, of course. What I do know for sure is that Bolsheviks refused to pay any of the debts of Russian Empire. And since they nationalized all of the Romanian industry, Western investors lost a lot of money. That is the reason why the West hated socialists so much. If the Western elites actually cared about people of the USSR, they wouldn't feel sympathetic towards the party which proclaimed those people subhumans. worthy of enslavement and genocide. By the way, I wonder why this young man doesn't want to talk about the trauma brought by this invasion. It's much more relevant. It strongly defies modern Russian society. Whatever. Civil War destroyed the Russian industry completely. It got back on track under Stalin. Western capital was involved, but as a trading partner. No Western shareholder got any rights to plants and factories of USSR. That is why Western elites hated Stalin. During the time of his reign, he wasn't officially in USSR, by the way. The country faced hunger, world war, and several instances of political crisis. So basically everything that Russian Empire had faced under Nikolai II, except worse. And yet the country survived. Food for thought. But this doesn't interest this young man. He didn't even bother to read about official USSR ideology. Lest it might look a little sympathetic, and something modern USA is desperately trying to copy.
The Soviet Union was so convinced communism was a failure that it let itself fall apart because it had no will to live.
It is a well-known fact that USSR lost 27 million people in World War II. The real number is probably much higher. Damage to infrastructure was enormous, it's hard to even count it. And it was done to the most populated areas of the country. Meanwhile, the USA barely got scratched. This is a true reason why the United States of America became the dominant power in the 20th century. Yet, against all odds, USSR took this challenge anyway because for the USSR it was a matter of survival. Catching up to USA and overtaking it became the ideal fix under Khrushchev. This created a strain on the economy and kicked off inflation. The ruling class was overtaken by opportunists and succumbed to gerontocracy. The member republics were divided on donors and dotation receivers, which created separatist tensions. Westerners adore to make the case that all those problems are exclusive to socialist system of governance. But they're not, and modern USA is a living proof of that. Nonetheless, the people of USSR were promised a new dawn, peace and prosperity, friendship with the West. Instead, they got the 90s, when entire families were hanging themselves. It inspired a new wave of anti-Western sentiment which first world countries like to ignore. This young man isn't just ignorant, his approach is wrong. From the start, he should have asked two simple questions. Number one, what do people living in Russia think of Western influence? Number two, what do Russians want? Or better yet, how do Russians understand freedom? That could have allowed him to actually look at the political adversary of his country instead of a horror story. I use the term the West instead of naming a specific country because from Russian perspective they're pretty much interchangeable. It doesn't matter which power dominates Europe, France, Germany, Austria, Britain, USA, they all end up having the same attitude towards Russia. A few interesting facts. Sheila Fitzpatrick found out that Gorbachev is hated in Russia, meanwhile Stalin is pretty popular. Richard Pipes found out that 56% of Russians didn't consider themselves Europeans, according to the poll conducted in 1998. He of course blamed the Mongol influence, wrote an entire article about it, which, as far as I know, was never published in English. People on Bolotnaya Square were waving socialist and anarchist flags. There are more facts like these, and searching them up could lead to some interesting findings about the Russian character. Like Russians hating the public health care going away in favor of private option. Or Russians having the same attitude towards public schools. Or Russians cheering when oligarchs run away from the country and lose their property. Russia always needed the West as a trading partner and a source of investment. Asia was pretty far away from Moscow, and most importantly, the political situation did not allow to develop the economic cooperation. Middle East was consistently hostile. Africa seemed unreachable. So the only alternative Russia had to cooperation with the West would be United States of America, which once wasn't seen as part of the West, but later became one. The video about understanding Russia as a political adversary to the United States of America should have used history in only one context, that is, understanding the relationship between Russia and USA. Then the author could move to modern conflicts between the two countries, and talk about political, social, and economic climate in Russia if he so wished, while using the sources from both sides, Russian and Western, preferably classifying them, because, let's say, British sources could talk differently than American ones. Meanwhile, Russian communists and Russian liberals disagree on pretty much every part of Russian history. But this young man isn't trying to understand Russia. He just wants to humiliate it.
Russia today seems like a hollow country. From what I've read and as I talk about in this video, Russia today is a society which has one of the weakest cultures in the world. They've purged everything in their culture that's organic or independent from the state.
The implication being that Russians cannot feel patriotism because it's reflected in the culture. That reminds me of the podcast on the Lotus Eaters. Once they made a video called Putin's Preposterous Propaganda.
Yeah, after all these examples of Russian preparation for global war, militarization, spreading all of these violence fantasies, how on earth did we not see this coming? Surely we should have been like, yeah, Russia is going to go for this, guys, and been far more prepared. This is obvious. It wasn't hidden. They're basically the sum total of Russian culture after the 90s, according to Sergei. And so he points out that many of those who went to Russia, like Russia specialists and so on, they would read what he calls Tolstoyevsky, so Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, Russian classic authors, and believe they know Russia. They have deep insight because of that. And they would ignore LiveJournal, Krylov, Holmogorov, Galkovsky, Kenik, Tiger, Legatus, Minar, like these really low-level pulp fiction authors, and which is who you really need to read to understand what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
So they ignored that because they spoiled the picture they wanted to believe, which is economic cooperation and change through trade, a bit like with China. Some rubbish books, well, we have them too in the West, yeah, but not this number, this concentrated focus, and this sheer level of ridiculousness. They said these warnings were nerdy, too detailed, focusing on abnormalities and missing the global perspective, over-exaggerated and even Russophobic.
Of course.
So maybe the very idea that a nation in the 21st century with all possible cooperation opportunities can willingly choose a path to war is just too scary to accept. And he has this lovely scenario, which I imagine, right? Imagine the reaction in Berlin or Washington. You are really saying that Russia will start a global World War III because they have published a book about a guy teleported into Hitler's mind and another one about Nicholas II preventing the revolution with an AGS-17 grenade launcher? You want us to sanction Nord Stream 2 because of 2 Pulp Fiction books? You know, it's a hard sell. But I just think this is a really interesting analysis of it. And there's another couple of comments that he puts in the replies which are worth putting up. So one person asked, well, okay, but are these really popular? You know, is this just some niche thing the government tried to do and it didn't work? Well, not really. Yes and no. So they weren't selling very well. Most of them have low ratings, about 3 out of 5. But you could argue that that combined with their popularity everywhere is just more the sign of a state program. And another thing he says is they were just everywhere. So even if you weren't buying them, weren't interested in them, you've got that like passive, what's it
Subliminal.
called? Yeah, that subliminal effect from just having it around you all the time.
This is the only time I know about where Westerners acknowledge the existence of anti-Western sentiment in Russian mass culture. Propagandist or alternative history is a very popular genre in Russian literature. There are entire series written in it, and it has a strong revanche sentiment. There are books that don't do that, but they still have a certain theme of patriotism, centering on ignorant Russians who see their history with their own eyes and learn to love their country. Both hosts are completely unaware about it, clearly not interested in further research, mock the tendency and practically dismiss it, and also ignore a very obvious problem. The books they were introduced to push opposing political ideologies. One is written by a supporter of USSR, another is sympathetic to the Russian Empire. Neither the hosts nor their source seem to notice it, and eagerly discuss if that could be just Putin's propaganda. Ever since the 90s, Russian celebrities in any cultural sphere became a sort of nobility. Their careers didn't depend much on their talent or their popularity, but on their connections. Connections meant that you could sign a contract with a company. Then you got their attention, doesn't matter if it's positive or negative. Have a name recognition? The contracts are yours. You can live off of commercials and guest appearances. If you turn out to be a good political prop, the government will give you money so you can develop the Russian culture, regardless of how many people actually watch your movies, buy your books, and listen to your songs. This approach led to the rise of nepotism and creative bankruptcy. When it came to the audience of ex-USSR, the right people relied on nostalgia baiting and copying the Western entertainment. Sometimes figuratively, as in working in genres such as sitcom, but in many cases literally adapting the Western intellectual property word for word. But the main goal was always the Western audience. That's where the money were flowing. This called for a special type of content. Historical dramas which have no connection to history and frame Russian national heroes as retards. The anti-USSR stories. And of course, the stories about horrible life in modern Russia. With some exceptions, everything that didn't fit the mold of the right people was bound to become niche. The academia also got westernized. Even school programs were touched by it. Russian children were taught that Russia is an autocracy which needs to change, and that economy dominated by services is better than economy dominated by production. Considering that Russians generally view Western countries with respect, since they achieved prosperity and influence, it is easy to believe that Russians, ordinary Russians, are on the Western side of history, and it's just the evil elites who could be against the Western countries, or more specifically United States of America. But it's the other way around. Up until recently, Russia was ruled by pro-Western elites. Putin's party was pro-Western and still is for the most part. Putin himself was very pro-Western. That's the reason why he's so upset about NATO expansion. From his point of view, he did everything he could to win the trust of the Western countries. Growing up in Russia of the 21st century was a never-ending trail of gaslighting. Be ashamed of your parents, they were communists. Be doubly ashamed of your grandparents, they were communists and stood up against Hitler and were nearly as bad as Hitler. Be ashamed of your ancestors, they built an empire. Be ashamed of yourself, you carry the imperial genes. Wanna be respected? Do your best to mimic those humans. You don't even count as one if you wanna stay the way you are. Better yet, Save your money and move to some other country and become cheap labor force. After all, what can you possibly love about Russia?
Внимание! Говорит и показывает Москва. Работают все центральные каналы телевидения. Смотрите и слушайте Москву.
The good thing here is that voids like this are meant to be filled. The esoteric organizations like the Masons think the next great civilization will come from Eastern Europe over the next few centuries. I'd like the Russians to prove them right.
Here's an interesting fact. Russian Empire fell, so did the USSR, but Russia remained, kept most of its lands and riches, never stopped being the world's largest country, always rose up after every downfall. Why is it so hard to assume that Russians can care about their homeland and be proud of it? Why is it so appealing to view Russians as slaves begging to be released? I have a guess. It's because no Western country ever had the strength to conquer Russia. No Western bloc had the strength to do it either. So all that remains is counting on traitors. Sorry, Western countries, the Russians' love for you is superficial. As soon as your golden image was shattered, you stopped being appealing. Even Navalny supporters don't always fit the bill. And then there are Russians like me, who despise when our country is being insulted in such a manner. When Russian history is being called a series of mistakes made by white people tainted by Asian influence. Wanna cry about Asian influence? Go ahead and read the Scythians. Russians are sticking to the path of Alexander Nevsky, the one which walked, unlike the failed alliance of Daniil Galinsky. Where will it lead us, I don't know. But I do know that I, a woman with a full-time job, has found the time to make this 2-hour-long video. And I don't regret it. It felt really good making it. Must be the wicked Tatar genes.